Everyone knows that politics isn't working. Everyone can feel that the country isn't where it should be. Tonight just could, be the turning point. From here on, I will give everything I have got to make it so, to ensure the name Makerfield is forever synonymous with bringing about the change this country needs. Bringing back something we've lost, hope for the future.
Andy Burnham, in the early hours of Friday morning, winning the Makerfield by-election, clearing the first hurdle on his potential journey to Downing Street to take over as Prime Minister. What has happened in Makerfield? Why does his more convincing win than people expected change the narrative? And what might Keir Starmer do? We will discuss all of those things on this episode of Newscast, which we were streaming live in the early hours of Friday morning. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. It's very early on a Friday morning and we've got the result from the Makerfield by-election. I say it's early, maybe for Chris Mason in Makerfield, the constituency, it's late because he's been up all night. Hello, Chris.
Yes, hello, morning, Adam. I am on a picnic table outside a budget hotel chain just next to the M6, just outside Ashton in Makerfield, so in the Makerfield constituency, which wakes up to a new MP and a familiar figure for folk round here, Andy Burnham, the, now former Mayor of Greater Manchester. Andy Burnham returns as an MP. There will be a mayoral by-election, and blimey, before we get to that, who on earth knows what's going to happen at Westminster?
Indeed. And just walking into the studio now, and maybe you will hear him or see him crossing over the camera, is Luke Tryl from the polling company More in Common. He's sitting down. A photo frame's been knocked over by some weird poltergeist because it wasn't by Luke. And while he's getting himself settled down and ready to analyse the results, we're also joined by Kevin Fitzpatrick, friend of Newscast, political reporter for BBC Radio Manchester. Morning/evening/day, Kevin.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Well, I've had a few too many coffees, I think. I'm looking a bit intense as I look at myself back in the picture.
And things are only going to get more intense. Kevin, do you want to give us the numbers first of all?
Yeah, so in the end, it was quite a comfortable victory for Andy Burnham. He got more than 24,000 votes, nearly 25, more than half of the total vote, and he ended up 9,000 votes ahead of Reform. Everybody else way behind them. So while it was a two-horse race, as had been predicted throughout the contest, in the end, Andy Burnham was way ahead, and it wasn't quite as close as many people had thought.
And Chris, people were saying, oh, we'll have to look at Andy Burnham's margin of victory because if the number of votes that Restore got plus Reform added together is potentially greater than what Andy Burnham achieved, then his whole argument about he can beat Reform and restore Labour's fortunes would be called into question. That's the theory that is consigned to the dustbin now, isn't it? Because his margin of victory was so big.
Yeah, it can sit in that file, quite a burgeoning file for folk like me, of hypothetical psephology that in the end didn't quite come to pass or become as significant as it might have done. I think as a sidebar to this by-election result, when you look at the results, Restore Britain coming third is interesting and, broadly speaking, suggests that, polls that had been done in the constituency, and polling in a constituency is not easy because you're trying to get a sample size that is representative of a relatively small geographical area. Those polls did point to something of a support for Restore Britain, and that played out in the result. But as you say, it wasn't a number that will be wildly sort of analysed in the coming hours, because even if you add Restore to Reform, they have still in total been miles behind Labour. And I think this is why the numbers here do matter in the conversation that is already getting underway as we have this newscast recording at 7 o'clock in the morning, and will continue throughout the day and throughout the weekend, which is that scale of victory. It was big, there's no doubt it was big. A couple of thoughts picking up from that. Thought number one is this. So the central argument being made by Andy Burnham here in the last 4 or 5 weeks was that fighting a seat like this would allow them to road test an argument that said that Andy Burnham as a Labour figurehead was somebody who could beat Nigel Farage and Reform. Now, clearly, here, Andy Burnham can say, and no doubt will say at a victory rally in the coming hours, that that's exactly what he can do, because that is exactly what he has done. There is, though, clearly a question, as we get into the next stage of this Andy Burnham story, to what extent is that transferable beyond Greater Manchester? Because there's no doubt Andy Burnham is popular in Greater Manchester. He has a track record in this constituency and then across the city region in several elections where he's performed very well. To what extent does that translate nationally? And then, what do we hear from the Prime Minister in the next couple of hours? He'll be in front of the cameras, I think, this side of lunchtime. What language does he pick in congratulating Andy Burnham? Is there any sense of a dilution of his defiance that I've heard directly in the two interviews I've done with Keir Starmer in the last week, and he's articulated defiance to plenty of others? And then how do Labour MPs respond? How does the Cabinet respond? It's going to be a fascinating few days.
And Chris, we'll pick up on lots of those threads throughout this episode of Newscast, which is being broadcast live on various platforms at the moment, but also could be listened to as a podcast later on Friday. Kevin, I'm struck that a lot of the coverage of Andy Burnham at a national level on podcasts and news bulletins was when he was posed questions as a kind of proto-prime minister. What would you do about the fiscal rules? What would you do about the WASPy women? What would you do about oil and gas in the North Sea? But you were there in the streets talking to the voters, watching the campaign unfold as a classic by-election. What was Andy Burnham's recipe for success?
Well, right from the start, he was adamant that this was a locally focused by-election for him. He tried edging away, didn't he, from questions about, well, why would it be better than Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, and what are his plans for the country more generally? And he did tap into this idea that he kept ramming home, and said in his acceptance speech as well that places like Makerfield had been neglected for too long, that the politicians hadn't listened, and that he believes with his unique and special combination of experience as an MP for 16 years as the MP for Leeds just up the road, and also his nearly 10 years overseeing the conurbation of Greater Manchester with its 10 councils and its record growth, the fastest growing economy in the country, that he was uniquely placed to go back to Parliament and orchestrate the change that he felt people in Makerfield needed. So he's been really focused whenever he could on the people, the issues, the things that he thought were topical and mattered to people in the area. He actually is across all the issues in the area, you know, things like flooding, things like antisocial behaviour in one area in Ashton and Makerfield Town Centre, because as Mayor he has had some involvement with trying to sort those things out. But he also did quite easily drift, didn't he, into what he saw as the things that needed to change with the country. And I think a lot of what he talked about hasn't been drilled into specifics, and what will be interesting in coming days and weeks is what is he going to articulate about this idea that he says, and is the night before the election, well, you know, it's time to end 40 years of trickle-down economics. These are big statements, aren't they? And I think while this campaign has focused locally as much as he could do, there are huge questions that he needs to answer if he does want to become Prime Minister.
And Kevin, not to put you on the spot with a hyper-local news story that you might not have covered personally, but I was really struck in an excellent article in the New Statesman this week about how Makerfield kind of represents lots of places in Britain. Will Lloyd, the journalist, zoomed in on this one particular thing, which was the illegal fly tipping, the huge illegal waste dump, basically at the end of a street. What can you tell us about that, just as a sort of emblem for what was going on in that part of the world?
Yeah, well, that's a huge illegal tip, which the authorities have just watched build and build over a couple of years, to the point where it was hundreds and hundreds of tonnes of illegally dumped waste. The residents kept complaining to the council, complaining to the Environment Agency, and they basically set up shop and watched and monitored as these lorries drove up and dumped all this waste, and the pile just got bigger and bigger. So that is an example of one of the scenarios in this constituency where people were saying, listen, we've got a huge problem here. You say you're on our side as politicians, and despite the best efforts of the local councillors in some ways, and the MP, Josh Simons, who has managed to get an intervention and the government to commit to clearing it, the people who live in that direct area and on the end of that street have had 2 or 3 years of an absolute horrendous ordeal. Similar situation with flooding down the road in a place called Platt Bridge, which was another topic. They got flooded 5 years ago, they got flooded 2 years ago. All the time, the government and the Environment Agency saying, oh, we really are committed to fixing this for you, but they were clearly further down the list than they wanted to be in terms of funding being allocated. So yeah, some real local, hyper-local issues, but examples people in the area felt of how the politicians talked a good game, but just didn't listen to them.
So interesting. And look, you were nodding there because I imagine you've heard those stories from lots of people because you've been doing lots of focus groups in the constituency over the last couple of weeks where you get groups of people together and just kind of peer into their hearts and their brains. Has Andy Burnham won for one big reason or for lots of different reasons?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think the central question of this by-election was basically the same in week one as it was on election day, because we were speaking to people throughout, which was, will Andy Burnham, as MP and Prime Minister, and lots of people knew, like everyone knew what this election was about, like, you know, that Andy Burnham was going to run for Prime Minister, would that ultimately benefit Makerfield, or was Makerfield being used as a stepping stone for Andy Burnham's ambition? And we heard a bit of both, but I think what has happened in the end is that sense that Andy Burnham, as an MP, as Prime Minister, that he can deliver the sort of change that places like Makerfield need. The other thing that we heard repeatedly were words like relatability, personability. You know, I couldn't quite believe the number of people that we spoke to in focus groups who said, you know, that they'd had a drink with him at a football match, that they had an Andy Burnham story, and that he precisely was able to marry up both those big kind of national issues, you know, people want progress on things like the cost of living, on the NHS, with those very local issues. So, you know, we heard a lot about vape shops in Ashton and people's frustration that they were sort of springing up everywhere. Exactly that, the flooding in Platt Bridge. So he managed to walk that line where everyone knew what this contest was about, but still enough people were convinced that he cared about the local too. And of course, he had his track record as mayor in order to, you know, give a bit of proof of concept to that.
I was chatting to one of his allies the other day there that said one of the things that kept on happening on the campaign trail is that he would get distracted by going into someone's house and he'd be late for everything. And at one point he was late because he'd been in someone's house because they wanted him to try a batch of jam that they just cooked. And he was like, yeah, I'll try the jam. Now, Chris, in terms of what Andy Burnham was serving for breakfast for us this morning, we got his victory speech at the, it wasn't a leisure centre, was it? Was it a church and community centre that the count was at?
Yeah, it's called the Edge. It's on the edge of Wigan and also the edge of the river. I think it's the River Douglas that runs through Wigan. Curiously, you know, you've rattled around for a while in journalism when you turn up at a by-election count centre and realise you've been to the building before. I did some filming a couple of years ago in a community supermarket that's based in the same building. And as you say, it's a community centre. It's also a church. It's hosted songs of praise. I think there's some sort of Pokemon cards exhibition going on Saturday. In other words, your classic kind of election count centre that's used for all sorts of things, and then every so often, I mean typically every 5 years, but these days sometimes more frequently than that, election ballot papers are counted in the middle of the night. And there we had Andy Burnham giving that victory speech at about 3:30 this morning, and the wheels are turning.
There's a biker rally in between the by-election and the Pokemon convention.
There we go. There's a very polite duo of bikers because they actually sought our permission to turn the engine on, and I thought, given how long newscasts go on, we could hardly ask them to wait. Mind you, we're now getting drowned out by a siren as well. This is the joy of live broadcasting, isn't it? As a fire engine goes zooming by. Oh, and a second one as well.
Chris has really rated the Newscast sound
Andy Burnham's
drawer.
Victory speech.
Yeah. Yes, powers it for us.
Exactly, Andy Burnham's victory speech. So so implicitly, each paragraph was pointing to a wider canvas than Makerfield, and explicitly, when you tied all the paragraphs together, it was in broad terms, his pitch to the Labour Party and his pitch to the country. Now, he pointedly didn't go further than what he has been saying in the campaign, grounding everything in the Makerfield constituency, even picking up on the criticism that he's faced from Reform UK and from others that he would use Makerfield as a springboard to higher ambitions, and the implication from his critics that he'd be on the first train to Westminster and never be seen again around here, whereas he said that here would ground him in what he did next, with the clear implication, even though he didn't say it, of what he would do as Prime Minister. Now, we're going to hear from Andy Burnham at a victory rally in a couple of hours. I don't expect in that rally he will go further in his language, or wildly further in his language, than he has done today. I suspect he'll kick around in the constituency over the weekend before he heads to Westminster on Monday. What will be intriguing is what happens in between now and then.
Chris, I'm just thinking, last time we spoke on Newscast, you were in the bus on the way back from the G7 summit, and Robert Peston was sneezing every 30 seconds. So every time I've spoken to you this week, there's been some aural intrusions. Look, in terms of Andy Burnham's victory speech, as I was listening to it while I was brushing my teeth before I came into the studio, I was at home, not brushing my teeth in the studio, I was struck by... he constantly referred to place. So he's either referring to place as a concept, like geography, or he was referring to Makerfield as a place that will guide him for whatever he does next. What's your take on the fact that kind of it sounds like geography is going to be back? And I'm speaking as somebody who studied geography at university at the same time as Chris studied geography at university. What do you think about this idea about that he's putting place front and centre of his sort of philosophy?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The sort of central cross-party diagnosis, basically since the Brexit referendum, is that there are too many places, too many communities in Britain that don't feel like they're part of the national story anymore. That, you know, some people say overlooked, left behind, others don't like that. But just this sense that actually we've become too reliant and too focused on London, not focused enough on community. And I think, you know, Andy Burnham's whole shtick from what he's done in Manchester is he's proven that actually it doesn't need to be London. You can regenerate a place. And I think now, you know, he is basically trying to apply the Makerfield test to the country as a whole, because, you know, as that New Statesman piece, which I agree was wonderful, said, there are lots of Makerfields around the country. And I think his pitch, you know, we don't think he's going to have great freedom if he becomes Prime Minister to make massive policy changes, not least because of the financial situation. But that focus on place, on devolution, on community pride, we know that that resonates. And actually, if you're a Labour Party that's looking for a weapon against reform, being rooted in community might be it.
Although, Chris, we've got lots of experience of a Prime Minister recently who put an emphasis on place, and it was Boris Johnson, and he called it levelling up, and it sort of didn't happen, and it didn't help him stay on as Prime Minister. So we've kind of seen this theory play out before.
We have, and that was a phrase, wasn't it? That was phraseology and indeed policy that I think people noticed. At least they noticed the intent. Whether or not people would have a different view as to whether it amounted to very much is a live question. But I think the difference, as we indulge a bit of place-based politics chat with two geography folk, you and me, Adam, the difference, I think, between the Boris Johnson policy and Andy Burnham's is that Andy Burnham's is rooted in a geography around his own experience, his own heritage and his own constituency as it now is, and therefore taps into a sense of, does a successful Labour leader, particularly in an era like this one with an insurgent Reform UK, need to be grounded and elected from a community where reform are competitive and reform can win? In other words, not from a seat in London, basically, North London, in the Prime Minister's case. You know, does that help ground Labour in a place that is more resilient? We've now got a articulated lorry doing a three-point turn behind us. I think they've come to collect the dirty linen. You know, does that ground Labour in a more resilient political place if and when Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister than it has been under Keir Starmer. I suppose that's maybe the distinction from the place-based politics of Boris Johnson. But he was keenly aware of it himself, wasn't he? And arguably, maybe, alongside plenty of other things, Jeremy Corbyn, Brexit, etc., it was a contributor in winning over some of those towns in the English Midlands and north of England that voted Conservative for the first time ever in plenty of cases in 2019, rejecting Labour.
And the other thing, Luke, about place, not to fixate on this concept, but I was struck that Andy Burnham said in his speech, I will put place before party, which is a very conscious echo of Keir Starmer saying I'll put country before party. And I just wonder how much that is going to be different if he takes over as Prime Minister.
I mean, I think the one thing that Andy Burnham does have is he genuinely does have in Greater Manchester a track record of working across party, across Greater Manchester. I think he got elected with 2/3 of the vote last time he ran. He won over people that vote for other parties. And certainly in the focus groups that we ran in the run-up to this election, it was clear, actually in an echo of Boris Johnson and the Red Wall, that there were voters of other parties who were lending their vote to Andy Burnham to give him a shot at bringing that change in Westminster. So we spoke to someone who said, I always vote Tory, but he actually said, but look, I know I can't get the Labour Party out for 3 years, but I can get Keir Starmer out in 2 weeks if I vote for Andy Burnham. Other people who are Greens, Liberal Democrats, saying we want to give him a shot to do that. So I genuinely think he does have some legitimacy when he talks about this idea of working kind of across the spectrum in a way that, the thing with Keir Starmer is he's never managed to reach out beyond Labour partisans. Aside from Liberal Democrats, actually, weirdly, Liberal Democrats often give Keir Starmer a higher approval rating than Labour voters, which is a little quirk. But beyond that, I think he's struggled with that.
Kevin, talking about places and talking about potential future elections, there is now, for definite, we know, going to be one in Greater Manchester for a new mayor. So irrespective of whether there's a Labour leadership contest, that contest is definitely going to happen, and it happens quite soon.
Yeah, and it's been triggered already because the legalities are that you can't be a mayor where you're also a police and crime commissioner, like we have here in Greater Manchester, and become an MP. And as soon as his name was read out as the victor in that contest earlier this morning, he had to effectively stand down as mayor. So that by-election has now been triggered. We've already had an email from the Greens saying that they're going to be announcing their candidate early next week. So straight from one by-election, very excited about the Greens. But yeah, that would be a huge by-election, a huge cost to the taxpayer, and that was one of the criticisms of Andy Burnham when he went for this role. And it's not clear, really isn't clear, who would step into the hole, because he's been such a big figure.
Right, Chris, let's talk about Keir Starmer, talking about big figures, or potentially former big figures, as some people are saying this morning. Let's look at the tweet he posted a little while ago. Congratulations, Andy Burnham, Labour's new MP for Makerfield. Voters chose Labour's campaign of hope and optimism over division and hate. So not exactly a sort of ringing endorsement of his new colleague at Westminster.
No, I think that is what you might describe as a sort of boilerplate public note of congratulation. As you say, he talked about Labour's campaign. Andy Burnham was at pains to be very personal in his branding in terms of vote Andy for us was one of the slogans, wasn't it, doing the rounds on the various boards here in the constituency. And, let's be frank, he was running a campaign against the incumbent Labour government's record. And you hear it in some of the reaction this morning from Richard Tice, for instance, the Deputy Leader of Reform, saying just that as he congratulated Andy Burnham on winning what he described as a very safe Labour seat, which, I mean, certainly in terms of its electoral history and sending MPs to Westminster is true, even if Reform's recent local election performance had suggested in this contest it was far from safe. As far as the Prime Minister is concerned, we are going to see him in front of the cameras in the next couple of hours. He will face journalists' questions. I think it might be what's known as a pool clip, where one journalist asks on behalf of all of the broadcasters half a dozen, if that, 2 or 3 questions. So, Yeah, what kind of language does he choose to adopt? Is there any watering down on his position? I know I said this a few minutes ago, but I think it's going to be key. You know, is there any watering down on that defiance? Last night my phone was ringing. This was whilst the polls were still open, but last night my phone was ringing with unsolicited offers of perspective from those who are clearly keen to sort of prop Keir Starmer up, pointing to the fact that he won a big majority 2 years ago, the various indicators that they think are now pointing in the right direction, whether it be on net migration or the economy or inflation, for instance, or indeed his handling of the international picture. So they're still having a crack at being defiant, but is there any flash of acknowledgement that the scale of this victory changes things? And then, over and above that, you know, what do Labour MPs do, particularly those who have not gone public so far with criticism of Keir Starmer or public demand that he ought to go? What about cabinet figures too? Are there conversations over this weekend where there is an attempt to persuade the Prime Minister that he ought to stand down? Or does that not happen and he remains defiant, and then one of the candidates, Andy Burnham, Wes Streeting, you know, anybody else who can muster the numbers, is somebody willing to go over the top and say, I've got the 81 MPs to back me, which is what a candidate would need, and therefore trigger a contest? And then at that point, Keir Starmer would have another decision, which is that once that scenario is live, does he actually go ahead with the thing he's been saying for months he would do and say he himself would stand?
And Chris, the vibes you seem to get from the Burnham campaign, and of course there are lots of people that speak for Andy Burnham because they like him rather than because they've sat in his kind of kitchen cabinet with him, seems to be that over the weekend Keir Starmer realises the writing is on the wall, sets out a timetable, there isn't even a contest at all, and it's just sort of by some kind of magic Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party. Is that what their dream scenario is? Or do they not even indulge in scenario planning with you?
That is, I mean, there's all sorts of scenarios that fly around and that some people indulge in, and it's fair to say, a bit like at various points in the Brexit referendum, or indeed if you ask anyone right now who might win the World Cup, you can make a plausible and intelligent and well-argued case for a particular outcome, but it doesn't necessarily have any greater degree of likelihood than the next scenario that you can also make a plausible and intelligent and reasonable case for. But yes, there are those who say perhaps the prime slash hope, because that's the other thing. Some people might say something as much because they hope it to happen rather than because they think it will happen. Those two things are in politics not always, in fact, often for some, rarely the same thing. But there are those who entertain exactly that scenario, that the Prime Minister realises the scale of the writing on the wall and is persuaded that perhaps he ought to, for his own sake, as some have articulated it to me, and for the sake of the party, to say that he will stand down, and that Andy Burnham proves that he has the numbers, and everyone else thinks, crikey, he's the most popular person we've got right now, and I wouldn't fancy taking him on in a internal election within the Labour Party, and he becomes the Prime Minister very quickly. Equally, it's possible that you end up in a situation where there's a contest either with or without Keir Starmer as a participant within it. Now, a week ago, Adam, when I sat down with the Prime Minister, I put to him exactly this scenario, which was a scenario where he has to decide whether to stand in a contest, where his decision to stand determines whether or not there is a contest at all, because of the prospect that others might decide that maybe they can negotiate a decent job in the cabinet or whatever, and they don't go through with the rigmarole of a contest that they think they're going to lose, and which subjects the country to a sort of protracted internal battle within the Labour Party, whilst that party is actually trying to govern the country. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Prime Minister didn't really want to get into that publicly. I can sort of understand that in terms of his potential to weaken his own position further by doing so. But that scenario would be a fascinating one, because Keir Starmer has constantly railed against what he sees as chaos in politics, constantly railed against all of those leadership moments the Conservatives went through. And in a scenario where he was an active contributor to what he describes as chaos, would he be willing to actually do it? Particularly if he was thinking nobody else will do it, and therefore he would be the trigger for that contest, even if it was caused originally by someone else.
Right, Chris, I'm going to let you go. Lots of reporting still to do from Makerfield, although I get the sense you'll be coming back to Westminster for the shenanigans with the Cabinet and the Labour Party, which means you will miss the Pokemon convention in Wigan. So
Damn it, I will. I haven't thought of that. The opportunity cost.
Yes. And Kevin, thank you so much for updating us from the campaign throughout this campaign, because we were doing episodes of By-Election Cast that you were a big part of. And thanks for being here with us this morning.
My pleasure.
And Luke, you're staying for a couple of minutes because next piece of homework for you, analysing the two by-elections that happened in Scotland. So there was Aberdeen South, which was taken by the Conservatives from the SNP with a huge swing of the vote. Their vote share was up 25%, which is kind of mind-blowing actually in British politics. And then Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, where the SNP held on. And those were by-elections triggered because the sitting SNP MPs had become members of the Scottish Parliament. What's your take on those?
Well, I think Aberdeen South is really interesting. I mean, that was an election which was, when we ran focus groups in Aberdeen South, because we also did there as well as Makerfield, the one thing people wanted to talk about was oil and gas. It was issue number 1, 2 and 3. The Conservatives ran a
In other words, drilling for more so that you can protect jobs that have been
exactly.
lost.
And, Aberdeen, the energy industry is a huge part of Aberdeen's economy. Real worries about what the transition might mean for them. The Conservatives lent into it. But interestingly, the other thing which came up in the focus group was that people noticed Kemi Badenoch's visit. In fact, Kemi Badenoch went up 3 times to Aberdeen South. That's really unusual for an opposition
Having been banging
leader.
the drum for new oil and gas for weeks and weeks and weeks nationally.
Exactly, and it's quite unusual for an opposition leader to do it because it kind of exposes you there. And there was some, that uptick we've seen in Kemi Badenoch's personal approvals, even though the Tory vote share has remained very flat. That was coming through in the groups there. So I think it was a bit of a combination. And I think the thing about Aberdeen South, which is really interesting, is that I think it compounds a bad night for reform. Because what you have is 3 things. You have reform making basically no progress in what should have been, in any other circumstance, an easy win in Makerfield. You've got Restore getting 7% of the vote, so it wasn't enough to make up the difference, but it still means they've got a real challenger on their right.
And if that happens in lots of other places, then they don't win.
Even if they get 3%, we think it costs them around 70 seats potentially as a snapshot. But then thirdly, in Aberdeen South, you've got the Conservatives proving that they still have a pulse and that the battle for the right might not be over. So if you take all of those 3 things together, that isn't great news for reform. The other by-election, I think, was interesting in the sense that, actually, if you look at Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, at the last general election, very close. Labour almost edged the SNP. What we see instead is the Labour vote totally collapses, the SNP vote actually increases, but the big story there is just how low the turnout was. It's the lowest turnout of the 3 contests, and it was another example of that in those SNP Labour seats where people say, well, I don't like the government at Westminster very much. I don't really like the government at Holyrood that much. It's all just a bit, as I think I said before on Newscast, it's just a bit meh. People just sat on their hands.
Is that an official polling terminology? Meh?
I think I'm making it one.
It is now.
I'm making it one.
Yeah, by saying it on By-Election Cast, you've made it one. It's entered the lexicon. And I'll just give you a last big thought about what might be about to happen in the Labour Party. And I just think when you look at public opinion and how people feel, do people buy the Keir Starmer argument that getting rid of him would be chaos, even though he's unpopular? Or do people buy the Andy Burnham argument about, well, actually, Labour needs to change and this is kind of the last chance and so something drastic needs to be done? Where are people?
Well, look, the thing is, people really liked it when Keir Starmer made that promise of a politics that treads more lightly, that they could go back to watching politics out of the side of their eyes. So instinctively, they would believe the Keir Starmer argument, except they don't believe he's delivered it. And from talking to people in Makerfield, the one thing which tended, we met some Starmer fans, but very few, the one thing that tended to unite Kenyon voters, Burnham voters, was a sense that the Prime Minister's time was coming to an end. I asked almost every group, do you think there's anything the Prime Minister could do to turn it round? And even people who were sympathetic to him said, we just don't think there is. And there were enough people who were backing Burnham because they thought he would lead to that change.
And then just a final thought about, kind of politics and leadership in general. And I'm thinking back to the old days when you were a special advisor to a government minister. How does it feel in the corridors of power when it sounds like power might be about to go to somebody else? And not because of an election, but because of politics and ambition and all the stuff that's unfolding now.
You just feel the air suck out of the place. And, the transition which I was there for was actually after the Brexit referendum. And I remember there's something in government, which I know you've talked about on Newscast before, called the grid, which controls all of the announcements. And I remember a couple of days after Brexit ringing up Number 10 saying, oh, can we get this on the grid slot? And I'm just going, Luke, there's no grid.
I'm surprised someone answers the phone.
Yeah. No, exactly. So it is a total change and a total shift. And, the civil service, the special advisors, Number 10, when the move happens, the move happens.
I also just wonder how long it takes to become ready to be Prime Minister. Can you do it with kind of a bit of a gist about what you want to achieve? Or actually, do you have to have a quite worked out plan? Because we've realised from Starmer, if you go in without a plan, it can get sticky quite quickly.
Yeah. And he had 2 years, at least 2 years when he knew he was likely to become Prime Minister. That said, I go back to what I say, is it likely there will be major policy differences between Burnham and so on? I think there might be changes of emphasis, and particularly on things like place and devolution.
Well, because there's already a big pride in place scheme. Just because Keir Starmer launched it, and the day he launched it was the day some Mandelson files came out. That policy still exists.
That does exist. I'm not sure the change will be big. I think the difference you get with Andy Burnham, if he becomes Prime Minister, and he may not, it may still be Keir Starmer, it may be any of the other contenders, but if it's him, I think the biggest advantage he gives Labour is a chance at a rehearing, a chance at a reset, where some of those actually quite popular policies, workers' rights, hugely popular, renters' rights, hugely popular across the political spectrum, the minimum wage, the stuff they've done on sewage, the social media ban, actually can a new leader, can someone like Andy Burnham who passes the relatability test, get enough people to give a look at that stuff and say, well, actually, the government's doing some good stuff.
And we're getting really, really far ahead of ourselves, and this is a massive hypothetical. But if Prime Minister Andy Burnham did at a general election what he did last night in Makerfield, that would be one of the most consequential election results we've ever had.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, he...
In terms of turning something around.
Yeah, completely turning something around. It is somewhat ironic, isn't it, that, myself included, and I still stand by it, I've been talking about the death of two-party politics now for quite a while, and yet the headline results from last night are a Conservative gain and a Labour hold, admittedly against different opponents. But if he could turn it around, it would be seismic. The only caution I would give is 2017, you go to Theresa May. She's hugely popular. People are calling her the second Thatcher. You get into an election campaign and everything changes.
That was in the 6-week period.
I'm just not sure that when you've got a 3-figure majority, you really risk it on an 3-figure majority and 3 years. Do you really risk it?
Well, interesting. Luke, thank you so much. And that's it for this episode of Newscast. Thank you for watching it as we've been recording it. It'll be available as a podcast on BBC Sounds later on today. We will be standing by as well to see what Andy Burnham says at his victory rally, how Keir Starmer responds when we actually see him in person, and then what do the Cabinet do? What do the Labour MPs do? What do the other parties do? As everyone ponders whether Keir Starmer is going to stay in Number 10 for much longer as a result of what happened in Makerfield outside Wigan this morning. Bye-bye.